Hello, welcome again, all of you. Here we are. I'm Masood Raja. Most of you know that. And today we will be talking about a very interesting topic, which I just chose because I get a lot of questions about this from my students as well as from colleagues and others who consider, my views about literature. Sometimes they find it odd. So I thought I should talk about literature and the question of value. So mostly, how do we think about literature and what value do we assign to it? And how do we come up with that value or that method of evaluations? What is the value of literature in our lives? And that's basically what usually the query is to me from a lot of people. And it's a complicated question to answer, but I thought if I briefly talk about it and then hear your views about it, we can figure out why is it that we define literature a certain way, assign it a certain value, and where does that value come from? That's the topic for today. And I hope more of you will join me on that. So Saqib, welcome. Then Oroko, welcome back. Hope you're well. I am doing well too. Glad to have you back here. And we'll wait a little for others to join in and then we can start our conversation. But in the meantime, please also know that I have now also launched on popular demand a separate channel which is called Raja Reads. And the reason for that is that a lot of people are just interested in new books. And they wanted me to introduce books that I've been reading, books that I like, books that I've read. So what I did was to make it a more general and less expert channel. I just decided to make this booktube channel so that anyone who's interested in some good recommendations for mostly fiction books, but mostly from all parts of the world. They can just go there and glean through it and see what books I recommend or I read and why. And so I do recommend that you should check it out whenever you have a minute and let me know what you think. So right now we only have Oroko here. So we'll wait for a little more people and then start our conversation. So meanwhile, if you already have some questions, let me know. And I'll briefly, give you my rationale. So my opinion about what constitutes literature or the literary and how I value it has evolved over the years. My early education was a very traditional boarding school in Pakistan, where the professors were trained in the old colonial style. And what was taught to me was somehow it could boil down to this idea as if literature by its very nature was special and it had certain inherent qualities that nothing else has. And then there was a certain degree of naturalness to literature and its quality. It was assumed that somehow you'll be able to tell whether it's good literature or not simply by reading it or looking at it. Now, those views, of course, have evolved over the years, and I can share that with you in a minute, but then I'm also interested in your views. So let me welcome Infinita Oroko. I'm doing well. Thank you so much. Chandra Mehta, welcome. Fayaz Ahmed, welcome. And before I go to your question, I will first give my views about why I consider literature as to what its value is. But I can start with Fayaz's question, and that's a really good question. It says, don't you think what constitutes literature is entirely subjective? Yes and no. because you will have to tell me what your definition of subjectivity is. That's where the biggest debates are, right? Because subjective is not necessarily an individual subjectivity, right? Your subjectivity, if you go through Althusser, is already in an ideology. And if we acknowledge that, that means other people can share that ideology as well. So at any given time when you and me are making our individual pronouncements, we are corresponding to a certain ideology in which we live. And if we do that, if we share that, then my subjective opinion could very easily correspond to your subjective opinion, because the values that we bring to bear upon a work of literature are socially and ideologically constructed. So it is subjective, but it can be more than that, right? And how can it be more than that? I mean, let's start from that it is not natural. Literature, as Terry Eagleton would tell you, it doesn't hit you on the head and say, I am literature, acknowledge me. What we expect to be literary, what we expect to be good literature, obviously is something that is socially constructed, ideologically constructed. What we prefer to be something good in language, the rhythm of language, the similes, the metaphors, the stories we tell, all of that we assign a value to, obviously is not natural, right? It is something that we have internalized, that any good story must have, any good novel must have. So that gives us the first insight. The question of value is intimately connected to our social position and the subjectivity that that social class or position creates. And if we buy into that, then we can extrapolate from that what we value in any literary text, or the value that we assign to it, may not necessarily just be inherent in the text itself, but that we bring it to the text. We bring our own value system to it and then judge it, right? So the value of literature then is contingent upon the reception of the reader, right? And that takes us to reception theory, right? Now, remember, we teach our students all these literary theories, right? At the core of all those literary theories, new criticism, structuralism, post-structuralism, new historicism, Marxism, is the question of value, right? What value do we assign to literature? How do we decide that value? What differentiates good literature from bad literature, right? So if you're a new critic, you will say that there are inherent constructions within a text that define whether it's a literary text or not. So you're privileging the text itself. If you are a reception theorist, you will say, well, there can be informed readings and there can be expert readings and there can be lay readings, readings by people who are not trained, depending on who is opining upon a text, and their prestigious location as a reader will assign value to the text. So let's say you review a novel on your website and I review it in New York Times. Because of my positioning as a New York Times reviewer, my estimation of the novel might be considered more weighty and more privileged, right? The difference isn't because we haven't read it. The difference is that one person is in a larger discourse of knowledge production where he or she has the privilege of enunciating certain opinions. But if we go through all of that, what we are learning one thing, and that is that the value is assigned by either a consciousness outside of the text, within a given discourse of value, evaluating the text, or we have internalized certain ways of thinking about literature through our education, through our gender identity, through our class biases, right? And then that is what enables us to decide the value of the text. I mean, think of it this way. Pick up any novel that has these powerful male characters, right? And chances are, if you read it uncritically as a man, you're like, oh man, this is a heroic journey. I mean, Dastan of Amir Hamza, I just talked about it yesterday. It's a great epic from the Middle East. I read it as a man all my life, and I realized now when I read it, it's a masculinist text. There are no women of agency and power in it. Even if they are there, they are subservient to men. Now that is a feminist reading. I can incorporate that because I'm sympathetic to feminist causes. If I'm an uncritical man who is bought into the idea of naturalized gender hierarchies, I'll be perfectly fine with that novel. Now, if a woman reads that novel and she's conscious of how gender roles play, to her, Dastan of Amir Hamza is not going to be this epic story of, what she can love. She would basically say, hey, this is just a male fantasy. All of those values that we are assigning to it are subjective, but subjective in a sense that at any given moment, we have a certain way of evaluating a text. Part of it is our training, part of it is what we have been taught to look for in a literary text, but part of it is also our subject position in the world. And there is no way of detaching that subject position from an act of reading. So these are my rough views. Now, those of you who have watched my lectures on Terry Eagleton's literary theory, you can already see I'm drawing so much on that. So that would then teach you that so much of what I think of literature is informed by a leftist progressive way of literary studies and a leftist way of looking at literature and assigning it value. The question of value then, in my opinion, is always contingent upon our class affiliations, our gender affiliations, the part of the world that we come from, and what we have internalized as good or bad literature, right? So let's go to Oroko's question. That's a really good question. So literature to me has always been a mode of escape to live other people's life and yet remain myself. Absolutely. So remember, that's what the Romantics believed in. So what your point of view is what the Romantics, critics, and poets believed in, that the world in which we live may be harsh, may not be what we want. So we use the work of literature to create this alternative, beautiful world. And as readers, then we can enter that world to escape whatever realities that at any given time we are not happy with, which we cannot alter. So in that sense, an engagement with literature becomes a sort of escape from reality. So the value of that literature then is connected to giving you solace, giving you a place to feel yourself or recuperate yourself. And so that value that you will assign to literature is dependent upon what you want it to be. And it's not something that literature naturally offers itself as. It can become that, right? So the value still is assigned by you because of your social and individual needs, right? So Muhammad Hafiz, how's your book reading method? Please guide us some tips regarding literature book reading. That's a really good question. I actually have a couple of videos on the channel that discuss my method of reading. Mostly, if you look at any book that I've read, I usually perform 2 readings at least of a book, but my books are heavily annotated. I leave myself notes. I highlight anything that I need to look up, anything that stands out. So by the time I'm done with the book, now remember I did a webinar on this, right? The season of migration to the north. And these are the notes from my rereading, if you look at it. But this time the notes were guided, not just by what I found fascinating, but what I thought will be important to discuss in our online webinar. So depending on what your reading is geared towards, if it is just for pleasure, right, or for escape, as Oroko pointed out, then you're not much interested in retention. You just want to read a book to enjoy it, right? But if it is geared towards a certain end, then ask yourself, what is the end of this book? Is it for an immediate project, in which I want to cite it or discuss this book, your annotations will then be different, because you'll be looking at the book from the point of view of this is what I'm arguing, or this paragraph will suit that, these pages will suit that. That will guide your act of reading. If it is a long-term reading project where you're reading for your own learning, right, then what you're highlighting is got nothing to do with an immediate project. You're making connections. Oh yeah, Foucault says this here, or so and so. Bourdieu has a similar concept. So you give yourself a hint. Go read Bourdieu, right? So that's a lifelong project. So an act of reading then involves, first of all, a book and you coming together, and then what you want from it, right? And depending on what you are looking for in a book will decide how you read it, right? Now, a lot of times I get questions from people from all over the world because people want quick answers. I'm very reluctant to give those kind of answers. I think that does a violence to the act of reading itself and books themselves. If you are in the field of literary studies and you want to go to the highest level of excellence in it, you want to get a PhD or a master's, there are no shortcuts to reading, right? So the best way of learning then is don't fall for those 15-minute summaries of the book. A summary can never sum up a book. Develop these long-term habits of reading. So to further answer your question, what is my method of reading? My method of reading is to read methodically, slowly, but read every day. So on average, I am reading at least 3 or 4 books at a time, depending on what my mood is. I have no deadlines. I don't say I have to finish this by tomorrow, because most of the times the books that I'm teaching, I've already read them before the semester. But I do give myself at least 2 hours a day to read on any topic that is on my mind. It could be something that I'm reading for my next book to write. It could be something where I found my knowledge was wanting. These days, it can also be something that you all suggested, right? And I have to, like last week, remember, Infinita had asked me to record something about interpellation. So after that lecture, I found myself pulling out Althusser's book and going over it and seeing, okay, now I have a clear understanding of it. So the reading is always motivated towards a certain end. If it is enjoyment, you will read differently. If it is scholarly work in the long run, you would read differently. If it is something connected to what you need to do immediately for a class, it will be guided differently. But one thing that you cannot omit is taking notes. They can either be annotations on the book or notes on the side if it's not your own book. But without that, you wouldn't be able to grasp what a book is saying or suggesting. Okay, so that was a good question. Let me welcome some more people. We have Pari Khan, welcome. Sad, welcome. Nadia, welcome from Morocco, mashallah. Sahar, welcome. Simab, is it Dr. Simab? Thank you so much for joining us. And then Oroko is already here. So let me go and see what's the next question. The next question again is from Fayaz. How is history different from literature, as there are historical accounts and history plays, etc.? That's a really interesting question. Of course, it is different from literature because literature takes history and reworks it. So if you were to take an example, right? History part of War and Peace by Tolstoy is the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. There are accounts of that everywhere, right? The literature part of it is that he uses the Napoleonic invasion as a backdrop and then tells the stories of characters that he invents himself who lived through those times. How did the larger history impact them? But beyond that, how did they live their lives? What class structure existed there? So if someone writes a history of Napoleonic invasion of Russia, chances are they won't tell us that there was these nobles and some of them were mean and they fell in love and they took care of each other and some of them were worried about this. All the historian will tell us is the historical events that unfolded. The work of literature is to use that historical knowledge as a scaffolding and then give us a narrative in which there are living, breathing characters who lived during those times. And I think that's a big distinction between historiography and literary production. The reason you call it a historical novel is because it uses larger historical events as a framing device to anchor the story to a certain historical time or a certain historical event, right? But you cannot make the mistake of reading a historical novel as actual history because it's playing with that history. And sometimes it may even modify it. So that's something to keep in mind. That's a good question. Isn't criticism invented to measure the value of a novel or a text? I won't use the word invented, but the purpose of criticism is to evaluate literature, right? But depending on where you are coming from, the method of evaluation can differ, right? If you are, let's say, Matthew Arnold, right? The famous essay, Functions of Criticism by Matthew Arnold, he would tell you that the critic should not get involved in everyday exigencies of life. That means what he's saying is literally the critic should not be political. And the reason that he gives for that is that if the critic does that, then his work or her work will not live long because it will be contingent upon the historical context within which he or she is writing. So what he calls it the scholarship of detachment, dispassionate scholarship, which means that a critic should only be worried about the long-term impact of his or her work. And they should constantly keep producing that, giving their opinions about different kinds of literary texts, so that in a long run, as their work is read later, it will have a long-term impact, right? That is Matthew Arnold. Then as we move forward, I mean, literature is crafted work. It's art, and it claims to have certain solutions towards problems or whatever. But if you watched my first video on Eagleton's chapter, The Rise of English, literary criticism was introduced, by F.R. Leavis and Q.D. Leavis and others because they wanted to claim a certain degree of specialization. They wanted to say that we are experts in this and we have certain scientific tools to study literature. And if we give an opinion about a poem, that is an expert opinion, and not everyone can have that opinion, right? But beyond that, once you have created the figure of the literary critic or an expert, it cannot be just a simple method. All of them are trying to help us understand a text, but also trying to tell us whether or not a text is good or not. That decision to even make it mean something or to assign value to it is what Eagleton and a lot of other Marxists would tell you is ideologically and socially constructed, right? That is, there is no way in which I approach a text with a transparent self and receive from it its value. The way I receive value from a text is what I take to it, and that is my politics, that is my assumptions of value. And those values, what I consider good literature or bad literature, are not natural, right? Those values are socially constructed, right? And can differ from one person to another, from one institution to another. So that is the point, the value of literature. Is it in literature itself? And can it teach myself the value that it has? Or do I bring to it a certain way of looking at it? And that way of looking at it decides for me the value of the text, right? So this is a good question. What is more helpful in evaluating a work, cognizance of contemporary critical theory, or rather being over-dependent upon it to the extent that one comes to neglect the significance of the moment in which a particular work was created, sometimes leads one to misinterpret works from the position of the author or from the ones from whom it was written? That's a really good question. And what it teaches us still, that our engagement with the text isn't just with the text itself. We should also look at the historicity of the very moment, the very time in which the text was produced. Okay. So if you're looking for just the meanings in a text, that meaning will still be extracted from your point of view. You are bringing yourself to it. But that is where its historical context will be important, because you don't want to go and read two male characters in a Shakespeare play and say, these are gay characters. You have to go to the historical precedents and see whether Shakespeare meant that or not, right? Because you are trying to maintain the historical integrity of what was permissible then. That is what we call revisionist work or presentism. Presentism basically is I take the assumptions of today and interpret a text that this is what it means because the knowledge I have today. You don't want to be guilty of presentism. But that applies only when you are dealing with what a text means. Right? When you are into the realm of what a text does, then you bring your own self. Right? Then you say, this is the moment of history in which I live, 21st century Pakistan. I am reading Season of Migration to the North. And this is what it means to me, because this is how I am receiving it. When you are into what a text does to you as a reader, to your thought and to your feelings, you are not bound to what the author meant, because you're beyond giving us the meanings of the text, right? Stanley Fish would tell you not to look for meanings in a text, but to look for what a text does within itself. How does it present its case stylistically, and what a text does to the reader, right? And so if you are focused on the reader and how does the text make you feel, you have the prerogative to do that because your interaction with the text is in the 21st century, right? So if you read Madame Bovary now, and instead of trying to go into the novel and say this is what it means by applying just a matrix from the present, you will be in perilous waters because you're dealing with the text and its meanings, but applying the current meaning-making processes to it. But if you go to it as a woman and say, this is a problematic text, this is a highly canonized text, but when I read it as a woman, I have a problem with this because this is what it can normalize if read uncritically. That is you bringing the present and your own condition to the act of reading. The most famous example of that is, of course, Chinua Achebe's indictment of Joseph Conrad, right, and of his racism. And Achebe does it on different levels by proving it within the text itself. But most importantly, what he's saying is he is bothered by the canonicity of the novel, and it is taught in high schools. And if it is taught uncritically, this is the kind of view of Africa the students will get. And the moment he invokes what kind of the view of Africa it would invoke and create, he is doing the kind of scholarship where he is not into what the text means, but what it does, right? So I hope that answers your question. There are no convincing answers, of course, in humanistic studies, but thinking about them differently will kind of make you more attentive to these things. So I have a question from Kalimullah. What is the role of literature in our daily lives? I have no idea. As Oroko pointed out earlier, he reads it just to enjoy outside the everyday exigencies of life. If literature does that for you, that's the role of literature in your life. If you are a moralistic scholar and you believe good books can make people better people, then you have a moral view of literature, and that's the role of literature in your life. If you are someone interested in social appearances and feel like mentioning Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and a few other cool authors will give you more of a social status amongst your friends, then that is the role of literature in your life. There is no single role that literature can play. And that teaches us yet the same thing, that the role of literature in life is contingent upon what we want it to be, how we want to mobilize it. The role of literature in my life is it's the medium through which I teach, right? So the role of literature for me is a didactic role. Anytime I'm picking up books for my courses, they are not just books that I'm picking up. It also depends on what do I want to do in a particular course. Is it just a course that introduces students to post-colonial studies, right? Then I will choose texts that can do that. If I'm teaching at a higher level of abstraction, a graduate course, for example, I teach a course about nationalism, cosmopolitanism, and globalization. Since that is the course, the role of literature in that course is to teach those three concepts and provide students with examples that they can discuss. So every single novel in there, every single theory book in there has the function of giving a course to students which can teach them about cosmopolitanism, globalization, nationalism, and then certain novels that deal with those issues. So depending on what you are seeking in literature is the role of literature in your life. Fayaz, how would we assess what is good literature and what is bad literature? Saadat Hassan, can literature be obscene? That also is entirely dependent on how your values are structured, right? What have you learned about good literature, right? Who taught you that? When you go to a literary text, even before you read it, you have already assigned it a value based on your assumptions of what constitutes good literature. Good literature, as Eagleton would say, doesn't walk up to you and hit you on the head and say, I am great literature. Great literature is literature because it is taught, because it gets intertwined into how we explain literature, how we talk about it, how we evaluate it, how we valorize it, right? Think of it from Persian tradition. Anytime I mention Saadi Shirazi to you, you might have not read a single verse of Saadi Shirazi, but you're like, that's a great literature, right? Hafiz, right? How many of you have read Hafiz? But he's a great poet. Do you know that for the longest time in Iran, the Iranians never really considered Omar Khayyam a great poet, right? But how does he become a great poet in the European tradition? Because he's translated, one of the first Persian poets to be translated. And suddenly Khayyam becomes this great Persian poet. Never really a great poet in the Persian tradition. And the reason he becomes that great poet is because he's made accessible. Then people associate all those feelings and those tropes and stereotypes to Iranian literature, right? So, Mudassar, the value of a literary work should be judged by the formal aspect of the work or content of the work. That's also, again, the chicken and egg question. There are formalists who would say you don't worry about the individual utterances in the text. See how the writer mobilizes the devices. And then there are reception theorists who's like, no, what do those devices do to a reader? What I'm trying to highlight is that the value of a text cannot be defined by a single matrix. And anytime you do that, you are assuming, you are privileging whatever ideological mode of reading the text you bring to it, right? Because it is determined by that. There is nothing inherent in a story that tells you, I am a great story. Stories become great because those of us who read them have a value system. That value system is socially and ideologically produced through schooling, through what our parents taught us, through what a culture deems valuable literature. And all of that comes to bear upon an act of reading. And that's the important thing to keep in mind. Is theory itself a commodity, agency accepting or rejecting an ideology? Yeah, I mean, it is a commodity because you have to mobilize it, but it is also a tool because there is no single theory, right? What is literary theory? Literary theory is you, me, and everyone else trying to figure out who has defined literature and in how many ways, who has tried to define what is the value of literature in the world and in how many ways, what constitutes a good poem, what constitutes a good novel. So there are different ways of defining that, right? And then you pick and choose. You say, this is what I believe in, this is what suits my purpose, this is what I agree with. And when you bring them all together, that is your mode of reading. That is what you privilege, right? And that becomes your theoretical understanding of textual studies, literary studies, as well as teaching. So there is no single theory. Similarly, there is no single individual mode of reading literature. Some people go and develop expertise in one or two literary theories and they become experts in it and read texts accordingly. Some people are eclectic, people like me. We look at a text and say, I want to talk about it, but this time, I want to use a different approach. I want to use this. So you're neither Marxist nor a culturalist, right? Nor a new critic. You are something in between. So it depends on what you yourself as a scholar assume is the right way of reading a text. And that is never going to be an individual decision, because the moment you assume a certain mode of reading, you are in an interpretive community, as Stanley Fish would famously teach you, right? So you can experience the text as an individual, the feelings that you feel or things that you think. But deep down, if you go and dissect it, you realize that even the deepest part of ourself is not our own. And the reason it is not our own is because we access and understand it through language. So if you are feeling distraught as you read a story or a book, do you think you're the only one who's feeling that? Are there any other people who might feel that as well? So even the most individual experiencing of a text is social, right? And can only be understood socially, right? So here is Learn English. Could you name the journals in which we can publish research papers on post-colonial literatures? I have written research papers and want to get them published. I think I've already previously answered this question. If you go to my website, postcolonial.net, there is a whole list of pages. Just go to post-colonial resources and scroll down and you will see post-colonial journals. There are about 80 journals listed there. Beyond that, go check them out, follow the links, find out what their publication policies are, what level do they publish, and then you can choose whichever you want to submit to. Good. So, Oracle, literature humanizes us. It makes us better. I think that's the role of literature. Really, very noble sentiment, right? But can it do it by itself? Can simply reading good books make us good people? Or simply reading high literature? That's the question I ask as a theorist of pedagogy. There's a really sad but funny sentence in Eagleton's, I think it is in literary theory, where people who argue that literature can make us better people, and he says that when the Allied forces liberated one of the death camps, I'm forgetting the name of the death camps, they found out that the commandant was a great admirer of Goethe, because all his collected works were right next to his table. But all those books of the greatest German literature didn't teach this person that it is not good and immoral to kill people in gas chambers, right? And Eagleton's famous sentence there is that at that moment someone had some explaining to do. So what he's basically saying is that literature does actually a negative impact on us too. How many times have you encountered people in your life? I have encountered graduate students like that who think they are better than others because they have read their Ben Jonson and Shakespeare, and they can speak in Foucauldian language, and they can do deconstruction. So sometimes uncritical learning of literature and literary theory can make us into these arrogant, judgmental people who look at other people as less than us because they aren't well read, or they are not educated enough, or they cannot appreciate the subtlety of a good work of literature. So literature that you and me would like to think humanizes us and can make us better human beings, and I absolutely agree it can do that if approached with a certain degree of humility and if taught through critical pedagogy, right? But if we don't do that, it can also produce the most snobbish and the most judgmental people on the planet. Think of it this way. I mean, how many literature professors have you encountered, right? I tell that to my colleagues sometimes when we get into our petty debates, right? And my idea is, look, we all claim that humanities can make us better, right? Here we are, masters of humanities. We have PhDs. If we cannot treat each other with human decency and can be petty, even though we have achieved the height of humanistic knowledge, then how do we expect to convince someone else that literature can humanize us, right? So, yeah, Oroko, I believe in it. I absolutely believe that good reading practices and good reading can help us become better human beings. But that leads us into this treacherous terrain of what we consider better human beings, right? Because we have to define it, right? So if we mean by that that it makes us empathetic, generous, and kind, then literature can do that. If we mean by it a better human being is someone who's aware, who looks at power critically, challenges it, it can do that as well, right? So this definition of literature can humanize us and make us better then is unstable at both ends, right? One, can it do that by itself? And two, how do we define human, right? How do we define being good, right? But I get the sense of it. I believe strongly that literature, carefully and compassionately taught, can do what you are saying. Absolutely. So thank you, sir. You have clarified a confusion about the ways to teach and interpret the works like Merchant of Venice and Tamerlane in the age of multiculturalism. Good. I'm glad. Yeah, anytime you teach Shakespeare or medieval literature or anything else, just remind your students that if that presentism is a big problem. And if they are doing that, you can tweak it by suggesting to them that you can bring your contemporary ideas, but only when you're trying to discuss what the text does in 21st century. What does it normalizes? Okay. Kalimullah, sir, please highlight the novel Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Thank you for your question. I have a whole playlist on the channel with about 10 videos on Heart of Darkness, including a 30-minute summary on it. So I can promise you that if you go through those videos and watch them, actually there is one 30-minute video that discusses the whole novel, and then about 7 or 8 that go chapter by chapter. Then there are affiliated videos that explain to you other people's point of view of the novel. So if you just follow my Heart of Darkness playlist and give it a weekend or two and watch it, I can promise you that it will answer pretty much all your questions. And if then even you still have questions, post a comment there and I will try to respond to it. Okay, who's my favorite writer in Urdu literature? Of course, I have it right here. Kuratullain Haider is my favorite writer. And then, of course, Minto, Ismat Chughtai, uh, all of the progressive writers. And then if you want in popular fiction, Ibn Safi was my favorite writer. Imran series, I read all of it. And when we were little, Ishtiaq Ahmed used to write these detective stories. So I loved those as well. What are the main differences between the 19th and 20th century literary criticism? I can't really answer that off the cuff. I'm terrible with dates. But I mean, 20th century literary criticism, you already know, bifurcates into so many different ways, right? Marxism becomes prominent, feminism becomes prominent, right? Post-structuralism becomes prominent, structuralism becomes prominent. All these major movements are 20th century movements. Even new criticism is a 20th century movement in literary criticism. So if you take it back, what is left then is historical criticism and biographical criticism or philology, right? I don't even know how you do philology. So there were linguistic studies, there were formalistic studies, mostly focusing on the classics, and then historical criticism, which would see literature as just a symptom between the. So the biggest difference is the 20th century doesn't tell us there is one way of reading the text other than the new critics. And literary criticism becomes more political and more engaged with the reader and the placement of the reader. So these are some of the general differences that you can trace. But there is no convincing answer to that. If someone asks you that question in an exam, it presupposes that you first lay out what the 19th century literary criticism was, which is a huge field, and then lay out what the 20th century literary criticism is, because it's not a one thing, right? And that will be a convincing answer to that. So yes, humility is essential for being humane as a literary teacher. Absolutely. Humility is essential for all things human, in my opinion. So Oroko, thanks for the elaboration. I'll look at the opposite end of the idea that literature makes us better. Oroko, thank you. But what I meant was that I absolutely agree that literature can do that. It can enable us to reflect. It can enable us to think on our own life. But theoretically speaking, when you say literature stops us in our track because it transports us in this other world, you're being a formalist, right? Or if you are a moralistic critic, you can say teaching different books from different parts of the world can make us. All of those arguments apply. But the question at the end of the day would be, does it do it by itself, or does it involve a kind of pedagogy that encourages our students to think reflectively as they read these novels? So I am with that critical pedagogy approach. My idea is that for literature to do all that, we have to first construct human subjectivities that would allow literature to do that, right? Because otherwise, it can also create the most snobbish and judgmental human subjectivities. Cool, Filmita. Thank you so much. I'm not going to put that comment on screen because, I don't think so. I'm all that and a bag of chips. But thank you so much for saying that. Okay. Yogesh Negi. Sir, I find more sense in Marxian ways of understanding literariness or literature. I think Raymond Williams' take on it is truly perfect. Great. Yes, I love Raymond Williams' works. My point is that we pick and choose. So if you like Williams and if you like his approach to what he considers literature, or Adorno or Horkheimer, just tell yourself, ask yourself, why do you like it, right? And then when you write about literature or read it from that point of view, you know why you're doing that. What I'm trying to say is that if you internalize their views of reading literature, then the value that you assign to any literature or any literary text would be mediated through that. Right? That's my point. It is totally immaterial to me as to which theorist, Marxist, or culturalist you use. Acknowledging that part of your view of literature is shaped by that knowledge is the beginning point of understanding that our approach and our assigning the value to literature and literary texts is not natural, right? It's discursively produced, ideologically produced, socially constructed. And if we acknowledge that, what that does is it gives us hope. It gives us hope to change. Because if it is etched on our soul how we receive a text, then there is no hope for us. We live a whole lifetime without changing our attitudes. But when we believe that things are socially constructed, ideologically posited, discursively produced, then we are leaving room for ourselves to grow, because what that teaches me as a scholar is that given us different set of circumstances, a different body of knowledge, a different context, I can maybe reevaluate my approaches to literature and read it differently. That is the subtle difference, between two approaches of considering an act of reading as permanently etched on our consciousness, or literary reading as socially produced, right, and discursively mediated. Okay. So, Enrique, in terms of application, does George Bataille has anything to offer? Absolutely. Now, I won't claim that I've read him carefully, but the whole idea of the abject and Bataille, somewhat if you've read your Deleuze and Guattari, he is in that school. But absolutely, there are scholars who absolutely use his work, and I have not done it because, to be very honest, I don't think so. I understand it clearly enough. But yeah, absolutely, people use Alain Badiou. I have used someone who is not even a literary critic. Like Logic of Sense, and no, that's Deleuze. But uh, people who are sociologists, I've used their work. Ethnographers, I've used their work to read my text. As long as you understand their work and pick up what you want to apply from there to the act of reading. Okay, Philmita. I agree with your idea about knowledge making people snobbish. I have been in this area 20 years and witnessed a lot of it in the combination of English language, literature, and theory. Yes, what I would like to actually highlight here is that even that literature doesn't do naturally. We can't say that if you've read too many books, you become snobbish and you become judgmental. What I'm saying is that uncritically read within a given elite culture, then that can become the yardstick with which you measure other human beings, right? So that means that the literary studies and literature has the potential in a given ideological situation to do the exact opposite of what we hope it does, right? And what we hope it does is that it makes us reflect on life and makes us better people, right? But given a wrong set of circumstances, not wrong, a different set of circumstances, it can create the most callous human subjectivities as well if people focus on just their erudition and their knowledge and use that to browbeat others in the world, right? So what that then highlights is that literature, no matter how good or bad it might be, requires a critically engaged pedagogy to make it into something that can be transformative, right? And that pedagogy will then not just dwell on know your Shakespeare and know your Chaucer and you're a good person. No, it has to go beyond that, right? And teach us It doesn't matter how much you know. You are not a good person simply because you can quote Goethe, right? You're a good person because you can read Goethe and then you can take some lessons from it and then go out in the world, right? And do some good. That involves dialectics, right? Literature by itself may do that for someone who's deeply reflective and is approaching a book not just to enjoy it, but also to see what wisdom it has. After all, I mean, think of it this way: all the sacred texts that we talk about, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, right? At least from the three monotheistic religions, but Hinduism, the Vedas, right? What do they claim? That if we read them carefully, they will teach us to be better human beings, better Muslims, better Hindus, better Christians, better Jews, right? That's what these texts claim. And by that, we mean if I'm a better Muslim, obviously I will have to be a better human being as well, right? I mean, what does otherwise being a better Christian or better Muslim mean? But we know people in our own lifetimes who have read these sacred texts, who practice these things, right? But then still end up being arrogant, terrible human beings. We can't blame the texts for that, right? The texts are not teaching them to be unkind, right? Or being ungenerous. Then what we can say is that these people got this knowledge, but along with that developed a certain kind of pride in their erudition, pride in their knowledge, and they thought knowing alone makes them better people, right? Literature does that too to people. My point then is that literature by itself neither can make you a good person nor a bad person. How you consume it, how you teach it, what you do with it is what that does, right? And that creates space for an enlightened mode of pedagogy, right? A kind of pedagogy that is engaged with this idea that this text here is an instrument. I will teach it to my students and they will learn about Sudan, but in the process of doing that, they will reflect on their own subjectivity and on their counterparts elsewhere in the world. That is what we call critical pedagogy, right? And without that, I think literature, any value that we assign to it, will not manifest itself. That's my point. Okay, Fayaz, sir, how can writers from ex-colonies represent their cultural sensibility by writing in colonizers' language? Is the usage of local words not insufficient? That's a huge debate. In African studies, that's a huge debate, the question of writing in native languages as well as in colonial languages. It will depend on your context, where you are. Personally, I absolutely believe that you can use the master's tools to dismantle his project. And I don't believe in any kind of purist ideologies. How can the post-colonial scholars do that? By being aware of both traditions. If you want to have an impact in the world, right, in the scholarly domain, you have to come to it from a place of knowledge. So how do you convince a metropolitan scholar that what you are saying matters? You say, I have mastered your vocabularies, right? And your debates. And now I have these 5 other languages that I can speak and read and write. And I'm going to draw from that tradition, use your language as a vehicle, and argue my point. So what are you mobilizing there then? The most formidable body of knowledge. You can draw from Persian, you can draw from Arabic, you can draw from Hindi, Punjabi. Do you think there are scholars enough in the West who can mount a response to that? You see how kind I come across to you. I am this person, but there are so many scholars whom I know who find me intimidating. Why do they find me intimidating? Because I can mobilize knowledge from 3 or 4 different traditions. So, post-colonial scholars, is it okay to just write in the little silo of your own culture? Yes, absolutely. It is okay. But do you want to have a global impact? if you want to challenge the assumptions being made about your culture, you cannot just shout in your own little silo and have an impact. No, you come and learn where the debate is, what someone else is saying, right, about you. And then you write a response with your knowledge of your own culture. So think of it this way. In 2005, there were these articles coming out by right wing American scholars on jihad and the jihadist movements. So I decided these people are like, I read books. Someone actually sent me a book by Michael Palmer to review. And there was a chapter titled "And Slay the Idolaters," right? Now, I imagined me as a typical American reader who is curious to read but may not be aware of the Quranic scholarship or Muslim jurisprudence and all, reading that, and it's like, man, their book tells them to kill Christians and Jews, right? That's the argument that Michael Palmer was making, that the Quran tells people to kill, right? So what could have I done? I could have gone and written a review in Urdu and published in Nawai Waqt, where I was like, I'm incensed with this, and let's go after Michael Palmer and all. What difference would have it made in the world, right? My people already know that in Pakistan, that there are scholars who just go after Islam and the Islamic world. But instead, I took my knowledge of the Quran, my reading of jihad. I wrote a 25-page article, right, in English, where I refute their claims. I explain what jihad is, how does it read within the context of the Quran, how is Surah At-Tawbah situated in the Quran, which was slightly didactic because it taught people its exact location, what we call in Urdu its Shan-e-Nuzul. I published that paper. Right? To write that paper, I had to have a complex subjectivity. I had to be aware of the debates in English language about one concept in Islam. I had to know my Arabic, my Urdu, my Farsi to go and extract resources about it. And I had to know a subtle understanding of language, 3 languages, to mobilize my response. Now, which one do you think has more impact? Me writing in Urdu and publishing it in a newspaper in Pakistan, or me reading these texts in English, writing not an apologetics, right? But an erudite response, a research response, and making it available to a global audience who is doing, and I'm not taking credit for any great grand gestures. What I'm saying is, who is doing more important cross-cultural work? So if you keep that in mind, it becomes immaterial whether you're using the colonizer's language or not, because you're mobilizing it to a certain larger purpose, right? And if you're doing that, then that is better than just saying, I'm going to dismiss French and Spanish because these are colonizers' languages, right? If that is the case, the Africans, as Chinwe Zhu says, totally should jettison Arabic from their culture and go back to their own native languages, right? Okay, Filmita, sorry. When it comes to discussing the books, the reason I can't take on new books is because I already have like a very busy schedule. So most of the time I'm cheating. I'm actually talking to you about books that I'm either teaching and about writing. And if I undertake like a specialized project, I will have to find time for that. But maybe someday we will do that. Okay, Infinita. I'm always suspicious of arrogant people. The best professionals I came across in my life were all humble people. They didn't need to show off. That's my experience. I absolutely agree with you. Most of the times, what I have noticed is that people who are large of heart, and people who know more, they don't go advertising their knowledge, or they don't go telling people I'm important. They actually act as normal people. Like, yeah, They know a lot of stuff, but they would have a conversation with you. They are not filled with their own importance. And I've noticed that most of the times people who act important, they tend to have not too much to offer. And it's a performance. And it's mostly also tends to be men. So I agree with you. I think if you look at life as we grow older, at any given time in our early life, we adopt a persona. Yeah? Our self is performative. And part of it is aspirational because you're trying to project onto other people as to who you are, right? And then over a lifetime, you forget that that was a performance, right? And you start living that life. You become that. You fill the performative aspect of it with content, right? So to speak. So I agree with you. I have never felt the need to overassert my positions or my own significance in the world. And it has given me problems professionally because sometimes when you're soft, when you speak softly and do not push your point and do not self-promote, right? People also think that you're weak, right? And and then sometimes you have to surprise people and tell them, no, I'm not weak. I just am soft. I don't assert myself like you do. But I absolutely agree with that without that kind of humility, I mean, think of it. I mean, I'm sitting in my office, right? I'm surrounded by about, I would say, 3,000 books. Every time I walk into this office, right, it's a humbling experience because okay, maybe I've read 90% of these books, but do I remember what I read? Do I understand? So these books are there to remind me. They are calling me, right? Hey, you don't know all that much. Don't prance around thinking that you know. You haven't read me. You haven't read me. So for a lot of people surrounding themselves with the books, it's not a traumatic experience for me. I love being surrounded by books. But a lot of people would do that because they want to take pride in their knowledge. For me, these are calls, right? Loving calls, not fearful calls. But these books remind me of so much that I do not know. And I think we all need that to keep ourselves grounded, right? To know that at the end of the day, no one knows everything, and that the little we know is not enough, but we should be willing to share it with others, right? More importantly, that we should be willing to learn from others, right? And that's how I see it too. But to me, humility, being down to earth, being accessible, I think is the cornerstone for me. If I were to assign value to a scholar and his or her work, I will look for that as well. I mean, how accessible they are. How do they treat people who may not have the same kind of power as they have, right? So I absolutely agree with you, Infinita. So the Kalimullah, modern arts movements and their impact on literature. I don't think so. I have any expertise in that. Now, if you watch my videos on literary theory, you will see a reference to Dadaism and Impressionism, but it would only be within the context of how modernism emerges, how literary criticism emerges. But other than that, you know, sadly, I can't claim any expertise in that. I might have to read up on it. I have a rough understanding of it, of course, but that's not a good enough understanding to offer as an answer here. Yeah. So let me sum up before we journey into all these other questions. Is what I started with was that, and it's not an original idea, that the value that we assign to literature, is not natural. What I meant by that was that it is socially constructed. And that if we go through, I was going to introduce, if we go through Louise Rosenblatt's work, right, that an act of reading is a transaction between the reader and the text. And the moment we agree with that premise, then what we are saying is that where the reader comes from has a bearing upon the value of a text, right? And if we agree with that assumption, that we can say that so much of what a text's value is dependent upon the context within which it is taught and read, is dependent upon the ideology that it espouses itself or that it engages in, and then what the reader brings to it as his or her system of evaluation. So to sum it all up, then, an value of literature then is in so many ways determined by the social values of the readers, right? And those values are ideological, are discursively produced, and are socially produced. That's where I would like to end this conversation. But since I mentioned Louise Rosenblatt, remember, she is the mother of reception theory, completely forgotten by male scholars. But in 1937, she writes this book, Literature as Exploration, in which she destroys the argument of the integral value of the text and basically teaches us that reading is a transaction between the reader and the text. And in order to really assign value to a text, we have to then understand what the reader does in an act of reading. Maybe we'll have a separate conversation on that some other day. So, sir, does literature make us wiser and sadder? We understand life and universe better after studying literature. Again, my answer to that is, and you already know the answer, is it could be both. For certain people who live urban lives and have to learn through education, right, literature can do that, right? It can teach us to be wiser. It can teach us to understand the world better, absolutely. To our own condition in the world better, absolutely. But in terms of can it make us a better human being? I mean, how many people do you know in your own life who might have never read a single work of literature, but they're kind, generous, and decent people? So this idea that we need literature to be civilized or to be better, generous, and kind people is also a class-based privileged idea that we literary scholars have invented to keep our jobs, right? How many of you have grandmothers and grandfathers and uncles and aunts who might have not lived in an urban setting, might have not even gone to school, but in terms of their human interactions, they are loving, they are kind, they understand the complexities of life, right? And they understand how to take care of the weak and the poor. And that teaches us that while literature might do that and make us into better people, people can still become better people without it, through lived experiences, through solidarity in their community, through interacting with other human beings. So in that sense, then literature is one of the modes in which we can learn that, but not the only mode through which we can do that. That would be my opinion on it. So I'm going to sum up, but there is one cautionary note that I do want to share. There is one thing that as literature scholars or students that we must not look for, and that is simple answers. And the reason I'm saying it is because as I'm interacting with more and more young people, I've realized that people would sometimes ask me to answer a very complex question in 2 or 3 sentences. Maybe they need it for an exam. But if you really want to be lifetime learners and scholars, keep in mind, there are never simple sentence answers to complex questions of humanities, right? And train yourself to do that. All that you're required to do as a humanist is to have an opinion and be willing to argue your point. No one should ever ask you, unless it's a date of birth or death or something of an author. Other than that, any answer that you give which you can argue the point is the right answer, okay, about any given literary text. Arup Chakrabarti, I've seen the point of views are different of literature students than others. Why so? I mean, it's the question of how are they being trained? You know, if you are in a business school or studying economics or math, you know, you are required to give the most precise answer. In literature, depending on where you look at it, the same text, the words on the page can have different importance, different significance, sometimes different meaning, because there is no mathematical answer. So you are bringing your own self to the method of extrapolation through which you are construing meaning or what a text does. So obviously, most literary readings can be open-ended. There can be differences of opinion. There can be even hard differences of opinion. And that is the nature of humanities, right? It is not math. It is not physics. It is you dealing with language rendered strange, or language in a poem. And the moment you are in the realm of language, you're in a realm where meaning can be fluid, where your own way of looking at the text can be different from others, right? And all of those things have a bearing on how you read a literary text and what you think it means, right? So that's, I think, what makes the evaluating literature hard, but makes the question of value of literature also complicated, but kind of something that can teach us also that it doesn't matter how we read literature, as long as we are engaging with it with a certain degree of humility and regard for others, right? We'll be fine. It's when we try to pinpoint the definitions and fix the meaning and try to implement that in humanities, that's when we run into trouble. Okay, I think we have talked a lot today. I think it's been about more than an hour. So thank you so much for joining me. So I'm going to formally end it here and say goodbye. And thank you so much for joining me. And as always, peace and love. Now, this will allow me to edit the video better. Now, I'll see if there are a couple of other questions. Okay, Sarah, I'll set for PhD content contest any alternative criticism for postmodernism and modernism. Another question, would you please suggest easy novels for the previous movements to study and criticize? So if you are interested in the debates about the postmodern and modernism, I already have quite a few videos on the channel and you can watch them. I don't know what you mean by easy novels. I mean, you know, pick up any novel and see if you find it hard or not. If you want a list of novels that I recommend to my students, just go to my website, postcolonial.net, go to postcolonial resources, scroll down, and there is a list of about 200 novels that my students read. I don't know what an easy novel would be, but, you know, I mean, most novels, unless they're high modernist and postmodernists, tend to be fairly easy reads. But here is another thing that I'm doing, and you can take a look at it, is I have another, I forgot to mention it, I have another channel that I just started. And the reason I started is to basically just do book introductions. And what I'm offering here is not complex debates about the novels, but just my understanding of a particular novel and my introduction to it. I highly recommend that you keep an eye on it, because I've already started developing some videos there, which tend to be not simpler, but I think more geared towards a person if they are curious about a certain novel and want to read it and just need basic information about it. So I will highly recommend you to check this out. It's called Raja Reads. I know the name is kind of cheesy, but I wanted it to be pretty apparent that it's about reading. So do check that one out. So, all right, let me see if I can remove this. So that's all I have today. And thank you so much. And I will soon announce what we'll be doing, next week. But feel free to suggest any topics. If they are in the realm of my, expertise, I'll be happy to talk about them. So I'll now see you all next week, hopefully. So take care and, peace and love. Bye-bye.